Big trick is, will it work for going to YouTube? Yes, it did. Oh, okay, that's because oh man, I have too many groups that I work with. Trick is, will it? There we go.
Oh, they're coming in.
Yeah. Not doing too bad. Anybody that would like to join the panel, raise your Zoom hand. Tony, you're muted.
So good morning, Robert. Whereabouts do you live in England?
Okay, well, I live in between. Let me see. I think the easiest way to explain it is that I live 1 hour from London.
Yeah, which way? What town?
Sure. Okay. The town is called Sittingbourne, and it's in between London and Canterbury.
Oh, okay. My wife and I have toured in England a lot, and we did go to Canterbury on a trip, so we probably passed where you live.
Yeah. Well, Canterbury is 20 minutes from me, so
yeah. Okay. So
I
yeah.
live very much sort of in the English countryside here.
Yeah, I love the English countryside.
Yeah. No, it's very well, I guess you could say sort of very close to where I am is very sort of quintessential English, or rose-fronted cottages and little cricket grounds and things.
Oh, yeah, that's the kind of scenery countryside I like to live in. It's very picturesque with the hedges and the rock walls and so forth. Yeah, so and London is probably one of my favorite cities. And whenever we go fly there, whether we are touring in the immediate area or it's a stop for somewhere else, we try to go to a play because I am very fond of plays in London.
Oh, well, you've got plenty to choose from there.
Yes. And the little Dixie cup of ice cream during intermission. Oh. Reminds me of my childhood.
That's obligatory.
Yeah. So anyway, welcome and thank you for meeting with us today.
Not at all. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Hey. Well, we'll get started here. Welcome everybody to the for us after Thanksgiving, and everybody hopefully had a good Thanksgiving and ate a lot. So we have a cold day, but sunny out at least. But today we have Robert. I didn't ask your last name, Canis.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Hey, got it right. So Robert's going to be giving us a talk in a minute. A few quick announcements. Next month, I will just be putting out a video that everybody will get a link to watch since it's Christmas Eve for us. And that wouldn't be a great day to hold a meeting. Too many things going on. So I will have a video. It's going to be covering all the new features in Lightroom, Photoshop, and probably Luminar Neo, especially their new Gen Swap feature that they've just added. So that will be December. January, we have Jamie Konarski-Davidson talking about lens babies. So far, February and March are empty, and I have another person for April that we have scheduled, but I got to get everything completely confirmed. So we're working on 2 more months after January, but we're starting to find a lot of different people to come and join and give a nice talk to our group. If anybody has suggestions, as always, please pass them on. I'm always looking for new photographers to have come and talk. And, you know, if you know of somebody, let me know and I will get a hold of them. So with that, Robert is a wildlife photographer living in Kent, England, born in 1970. He's always had a fascination with the natural world. And from the moment he first picked up a camera, which was a Brownie 127, boy, at the age of 6, I started with an Instamatic 126 cartridge camera. Yeah, and I got hooked then too. I was a little older though. I was like 10. Although he considers himself a stay-at-home photographer, where a great percentage of his work is undertaken nearby over the years. He's had a growing fascination with Northern and Eastern Europe, which has resulted in numerous trips to Poland, Finland, Norway, Iceland, and the Czech Republic, where he now regularly leads landscape and wildlife photography workshop tours. He loves to travel, teach, and impart his knowledge and experience. So this is a dream for his come true. He's going to be talking about, it's the Nordic areas, right?
Correct. Yes.
So I will turn this over to Robert. Let me place the spotlight.
All right, fantastic. All right. Okay, thank you very much. If we go on to screen share, and hopefully this will work. So nod if you can see the title image.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yep. Perfect.
That's a good start. Okay.
Yeah.
Some of you might be scratching your heads wondering what it is that you're looking at. You're looking at the rear end of a black grouse on a snowy field. I just loved the graphic quality of it when it literally presented itself to me while photographing it in Finland last year. But let's go on to the first image here. Okay, so let's start with my interest really, I guess, in the Nordics, but specifically Finland, which actually began many, many years ago in my teens when I was studying photography in London. As was said in the introduction, I've always been fascinated in the natural world. That came before photography, as it so often does, you know, a love of the outdoors, as it were. And in fact, I live in the same town where I was born. So I was sort of born and raised here, born and bred, as it were. And I live but a stone's throw, really, a short cycle ride when I was young, from woodlands and orchards and various other sort of habitats that I was able to get myself to and photograph. So I was 16, 17 when I was attending college in London. I became aware of this Finnish nature photographer who was world renowned, but one whom I had never heard of, called Hannu Hautala. He is widely regarded as being the grandfather of Finnish nature photography when us Brits particularly, and in fact most Europeans, and dare I say photographers from the US as well, during the 70s and 80s were photographing birds and animals, but as close up as possible. But here all of a sudden was this chap, this very long bearded, bespectacled, round glassed chap called Hannu Hautala, who then started photographing birds and animals small in the frame. And it was the complete antithesis really of what other photographers had been doing, photographing birds at the nest close up, or foxes and badgers, etc. But he would present an image not dissimilar to something like this, of a whooper swan showing the habitat, or it might be smaller still, it might be of a woodpecker that only occupied sort of a 50th of the frame of a grove of birch trees or aspens. So he's really putting it into context and letting the play of the beautiful Finnish light play its part. So I all of a sudden became aware of this photographer, and what really struck me was that he was photographing bears and eagles and owls in a country that for me was no more than a 3-hour flight away. When TV programs were full of African wildlife and tigers in India, for example, and Antarctica. Although Finland seemed less exotic, it had an appeal of being a very sort of wild country bordering Russia. In fact, the Finnish name Suomi means swampland. So it's made up predominantly actually of forest. 70% of Finland is made up of forest, but it has close on 200,000 lakes. Interestingly, 90% of which you can drink from. Certainly when I've gone hiking and traveling in Finland, you can just fill up your water bottle in a lake or a stream and it's completely pure. You can drink from it. It's a really beautiful place to photograph. So there lay my fascination very early on. And about 10 years later, I found myself visiting Finland and have done so ever since and more regularly. And since then, innumerable trips to Norway, to the Faroes and to Iceland. And some to Sweden as well. But in spring is a time in the Nordics when wildlife really starts to become incredibly active. As you can imagine, our winters that far north, let's say even 66 degrees and further, is very long indeed. At the moment, it's about -10 in the Nordics, at least in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, with quite a bit of snow. That would be the same kind of temperatures that you'd find in April and May. So after that very long winter, all of a sudden swans are starting to find areas, lakes, for example, where the water has started to take place of ice, and they're very territorial at this time. And it's a wonderful time of the year to photograph when swans are pairing up and are also not all that worried about people sort of lying prone on the ground photographing them. I guess like a lot of wildlife, so long as you don't make sudden movements and you remain reasonably stationary. And these are completely wild swans as well, but they were so taken up with pairing up and courting that they took very little notice of me laying in the snow photographing them. Other wildlife in Norway, Sweden, Finland, not so much Denmark and Iceland, because Iceland, as you can imagine, and along with the Faroe Islands as well, actually, has very, very little tree cover. The Faroes, practically none at all. Iceland used to be covered up to 40% in forest, which is remarkable when if ever any of your members have been to Iceland, it's completely devoid of forest other than the occasional grove of conifer trees. But of course, not so the case in Norway, Sweden and Finland, where we also get this tremendous character called a capercaillie. Here in the UK, we have them only in Scotland, but their numbers have massively declined over the last 50 years or so because of deforestation, which is something which we hear about in whatever country that you live. Caledonian pine forests, the ancient pine woods of Scotland, are what is necessary for the capercaillie, crested tits and red squirrels, etc. And so there's a number of rewilding programs now which are proving to be very successful, where conservation organizations are getting together with landowners and they're turning over moorland and conifer plantations to replanting and rewilding areas in the hope that species such as the capercaillie will come back to their former glory. But these are tremendous kind of turkey-sized birds, and occasionally you might come across a rogue male that, as you're walking through a forest, sees you as being competition. So it's not unusual to get, I won't say attacked, it's kind of too hard a word, but certainly pecked quite viciously by these rather, I say, sort of large birds that have very sort of sharp bills, but they're tremendous characters of the woods. A little more exotic, I guess you could say, but this is a young, in fact, a juvenile goshawk, which in spring, last year's birds will be calling to one another and really making a racket in the woodlands of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. I had the fantastic opportunity, excuse me, in the spring to photograph these when a lot of snow lay on the ground. It was, you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to speak in Celsius here, 14 below, minus 14 Celsius, so you'd have to calculate that. But so this was middle of April, when spring in the Nordics really is kicking off. And along with young birds that were calling to one another, we had sort of fully grown female goshawks as well. And these are absolutely amazing birds, goshawks. Quite a considerable size, unlike their smaller cousins, sparrowhawks, which you tend to find in more dense woodlands. Goshawks you find in more open areas, predominantly coniferous pine forests as well, tremendously powerful claws. And it took quite a few opportunities, as you can appreciate, before I secured this image of one landing on its prey. A few words about the equipment that I use. I use Nikon equipment, have always done so ever since I was sort of 12 or 13 years of age in the days of film, of course, starting with a Nikon FE and then F3, F4, etc. I continue to use Nikon, albeit I occasionally use the Olympus Micro Four Thirds system as well when I'm hiking, when I'm doing lots of walking. It's incredibly light, the Micro Four Thirds, and the image stabilization is really second to none. So I tend to reserve the Micro Four Thirds outfit for when I'm going on hikes, and when generally actually when I'm leading workshops, so that I can just remain light and in inverted commas flight of foot, so to speak, so I'm not bogged down with very heavy full frame equipment. But for my wildlife and for my flowers and birds and animal work, I tend to use a Nikon Z8 with a 400mm 4.5 with a 1.4 converter. Pretty much all the images you're going to see here have been taken with a Nikon D850 and perhaps a Nikon D810 in the days of a sort of DSLRs. And it was while photographing these birds that it really sort of struck home to me that when photographing wildlife, there really is no place these days for DSLRs. It has to be mirrorless, because DSLRs are just so darn noisy, period. While photographing owls or grouse or any bird or mammal from a hide, the sound of a DSLR is so noisy that often it will stop them in their tracks, and they'll look at the camera and maybe act in a kind of a slightly sort of stressed out way. But with mirrorless, of course, is completely silent. And furthermore, there's no movement of the mirror, which some birds, herons, for example, which have incredibly keen eyesight, I've noticed even from a distance, when they were unable to even hear the shutter, they could see the mirror flapping up through the telephoto objective. Mirrorless cameras are absolutely wonderful now. And what with eye tracking as well is really just blows my mind, just how it manages to keep up with wildlife. But this for me has to be my favorite of all birds, and I know you have them in North America. It's the great grey owl. And we call them the spirit of the North. I'm quite lucky in that from the UK, I can reach every country in the Nordics, bar Greenland, within 2 hours, within about 3 hour flight, I would say, 2.5 to 3 hour flight. Hence why I go there quite often with and without clients. Sometimes I hike or I go canoeing with Finnish friends, and that's a wonderful experience, of course, to be able to ski in winter on frozen lakes, or to experience the midnight sun in Norway, Sweden, for example. But these are just absolutely stunning birds, and aren't particularly afraid of photographers at all. We made ourselves some temporary snow holes just to lower our perspective somewhat, and just watched it as it went about. We don't use any kind of bait here, so we weren't using live bait or anything like that. It was kind of just getting on with its own devices. And of course, it was just enthralling for us to be photographing these. And to give you an idea just how close we were, these were taken with a 70 to 200mm lens. So I wasn't using sort of a 5 or a 600mm. They were flying within 3 to 5 meters of the camera, too close sometimes, in fact. So really was good. I'm not sure these kind of photographs would ever have been possible with film and manual focus. No matter how good we became at focusing manually, to photograph confidently a bird in flight coming toward you at between 10 and 20 miles per hour, shall we say, would have been quite a feat to have achieved a really, really pin sharp image. But certainly with digital cameras, and even more so with the latest incarnations of Canon and Olympus, Sony, Nikon, it's becoming, I wouldn't say easy, because as Ansel Adams once said, it's still, it's the 6 inches behind the viewfinder that really counts. It certainly helps with keeping up with these guys, that's for sure. But aren't they just fantastic? Their faces are designed, evolution has sort of equipped them with this enormous facial disc that funnels sound and funnels sound into their ears, so they can find their prey, locate their prey much more effectively. than if the face were just kind of flat on, as it were. So apart from owls and raptors, we have one of nature's great spectacles. In the Scandinavian countries and Finland, the Finns don't really see themselves as being Scandinavia. Scandinavia, strictly speaking, is Iceland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Finland is Finland, they'll tell you. It's not Scandinavia. And so they're obviously very, very proud of that. And that is the lek of black grouse. I'm not sure if you have them in the States. I'm not sure, actually, if you do or
I'm
not.
not sure myself. Now, are you shooting wide open with this stuff? It
I
looks
am.
like you got a very shallow depth of field.
Yeah, well, black grouse in particular will come to their lek at dawn. So this would have been photographed, shall I say, sort of the second week of April. We would get into the hides, of which you'll see a photograph in a minute, about an hour before dawn. So you're in there very, very early. Now, these leks are ancestral, so they would be perhaps using this same patch of meadow for who knows, however many years.
Interesting.
Indeed, yeah, and they'll all gather, but they're very fussy. So, in terms of the weather in which they come down, so if it's too cold, if it's too windy, they'll just sit annoyingly at the tops of trees and not come down. So you pray, ideally, you want temperatures around the 0 mark, and you want very, very little wind. And of course, it's a little bit worrying when you've got 6 or 7 clients with you, all waiting for these birds to come down. And you know all too well, if it's -10 and there's, say, 10, 15 miles per hour wind, it's unlikely they'll come down. But it's a chance you take, of course, with wildlife photography. And you kind of, as long as you put yourself in a position where if something happens, you can, really capitalize on it, then that's really all you can do. So yeah, these were photographed early in the morning. So of course, using a wide aperture was a prerequisite here to get as fast a shutter speed as possible. I tend not to worry about what ISO I'm shooting with, since I think the feel and the aesthetics of an image is far more important than whether or not you've got some grain or noise coming into the equation. So I tend not to worry what the ISO is doing at all. When photographing foxes and badgers, for example, I've quite often shot at 50 or even 100,000 ISO. I'd rather keep photographing than stop, quite frankly, because I feel that the noise or the pixels getting too high. And we have Topaz denoise, which does a fantastic job of reading a lot of images of noise. So like all things, whether it be with Lightroom or Photoshop, if it's used with care and not being too vigorous with the sliders, can give us some really outstanding results. But these are easily one of the probably the most difficult bird that I photographed. With the majority of birds that are flying, they do so in a certain direction, generally depending on wind speed and the direction of the wind. They like to fly into the wind, birds, and birds of prey and swans, for example, are quite easy because they're large. Not so much if you're photographing a swallow or a swift, but something like a grouse, which is fighting, and they'll eye each other up, and just when you think they're about to go into battle, they'll twist round. They'll then go one way 20 yards or so, then go another way 20 yards or so, and then they'll all fly up in the air, and then they'll come back down again. It's, you're really, your lens, as you can imagine, is going left, right, top and down again. But amazing if you get them all battling in front of you. Females will generally be at the tops of trees, maybe just 1 or 2 females. More often than not, anything between 6 and 40 males. You can get, the whole field can be full of grouse on a really active morning. But generally speaking, I would say about a dozen is the norm. So females are just sitting at the tops of trees, looking at all the guys, showing off, having a fight. And whatever one impresses her most is the one that she'll mate with. Now, that there is, what you can see here are the hides which I choose to use. There's the sitting down variety, which is slightly bigger than these. So if you choose to have a bit more comfort, you can sit in a heated hide and photograph. But I like to get as low as possible. Needless to say, when you're low to the ground, you get a much more intimate perspective when you're low down. So whether I'm photographing a grouse or a wading bird, like a godwit or even a swan in the lake, then I much prefer to be at the animal's point of view. also it greatly helps with depth of field, because if you're at ground level and you're shooting at a wide aperture, say 4 or 5.6, then the background is the distant trees. But the higher you are, your background then just becomes the ground upon which it's standing on or swimming upon. So getting a low angle is really, really useful for this. Sure, it's less comfortable, but I always like to think that the results outweigh the discomfort that one has to endure to get these photographs. So this is my setup. So this would be on the left. You'll see a Nikon D850 with a battery grip and a 200 to 400 f4 lens, and that's for the last 10 years. That's been my bread and butter lens, I guess you could say, that 200 to 400. It's an f4 aperture throughout, so regardless of whether it's on 200 or 400, and it's on a gimbal style head. No tripod, because there's no need, and you're limited for room there, so everything is just bolted onto a bit of wood, as you can see there. So I'm no more than sort of 8 to 10 inches above the ground, and an angle viewfinder attachment. Now, I could use the tilting screen, but I find that I can compose and follow action much more effectively with an angle viewfinder than I can with a tilting screen, particularly if I'm doing macro photography. And the camera on the right, I think that was a Nikon, another D850, might be a D810, with a 70 to 200, just in case they came a little closer. The candles are lit in order to get the frost off the glass early in the morning. I think on this particular morning it was 14 below Celsius, so I'm not sure again what that is in Fahrenheit. So the candles are lit just to keep the frost at bay, and that's my view. Now it's one-way glass, so I can see out, but the birds are seeing a reflection of themselves. And this works.
That's about 6 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay, thank you. 6 or 7 degrees. Okay, great. Probably nothing compared to what you guys experience in the winter. Still, it's April, and yeah, 6 or 7 degrees, I guess, is still quite chilly. And particularly, you know, as photographers, and you encounter a lot of snow where you are, it's the standing around, isn't it? That's what does it. If you're clearing your driveway of snow, or you're walking around, then you don't feel the cold anywhere near as much as when you're just standing still photographing a landscape, or if you're waiting for something to appear. That's when the cold really seeps through, and you realize the importance of really good boots. You know, that immediate contact with the ground. Not enough can be spent on a great pair of boots. Furthermore, you know, some good gloves that enable us to remain dexterous with our camera controls, and a good hat. But generally, you know, it's keeping your feet warm, I find, which is the key to keeping yourself warm throughout. Standing on ice or snow for anything longer than an hour, and it really does start to seep through. So here we have just a sequence of grouse really going for it. And you know, the beauty of still photography is that we're able to stop moments in time like this that is just invisible to the eye. As far as settings were concerned, I like to use manual exposure when I'm photographing high contrast situations like this. So I don't rely on auto ISO, not here anyway, or aperture priority or shutter priority. I want to meter for the snow and go as far with the histogram as possible until the highlights start to clip. So I'll put in my desired, or manual exposure, my desired shutter speed and aperture. So for this, let's say f4, I want to shoot at about 2,000th of a second, because I know that any slower, I'll get some blur. And then I just move the ISO setting until that histogram is almost clipping the whites. And then I leave it there. So I want to expose for the shadows generally, but I still want to retain detail in the feathers, of course, and in these brighter areas, and even down here. Not worried if the very, very lower parts are clipping a touch, because they're not so important, but incredibly important that their feathers are well exposed, and their and the shadier side of the bird as well. So that's generally how I work when working in the winter, and when light is constant, manual exposure, then just keep moving the histogram over until I start clipping. Oof, feather and fur flying everywhere there, 2,000th of a second. It's a remarkable it's a remarkable thing to see black grouse when they're lecking. You get this sort of bubbling call that you can hear behind you or some distance away, and then all of a sudden you've got this strutting bird with its fanned tail, perhaps sort of 10, 20 feet away. And then you just hope and pray that others are going to join it. Once you get one bird down, it almost acts as a decoy. And once one is down, then others feel confident that that it's safe enough for them to come down as well. And that's when you really start getting things happening.
Do you get a color cast when shooting through that one-way glass?
Oh, I beg your pardon. If we go back, you'll see that actually they're not shooting through the one-way glass. They're I only view with a one-way glass. That's a sleeve,
Okay.
like we call it a nurse's sleeve because it's similar to what nurses would wear tight to their arms. So we call it. So we're looking through a sleeve there. So the sleeve is pulled tight around the camera. So I'm not looking through any glass at all. The glass is purely for viewing purposes.
Oh, okay.
The
Okay.
camera, so there's nothing obscure in the lens at all.
Oh, that's really interesting how you did that. Yeah.
Yeah, so if I go to this image here, you can see how you've got a draw cord there, which is pulled tight around the lens. So you can keep whatever warmth there is inside the hide, but nothing. So yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So
I'm
you
not,
actually have a hole through the lens, through the
correct.
glass for your
Yeah,
lens to shoot in. Huh.
that's correct. Yeah.
Never would have thought of doing that. Interesting. Okay. Glad we asked.
Similarly here when photographing bears. Yeah, in the Nordic countries, as far as bear populations are concerned, there's really only two countries that have a good population of them. One is Finland, of which they have about 1,500 bears. Norway only have a couple of hundred. Sweden only have a couple of hundred. Iceland, none, nor Denmark, nor Greenland, at least not Ursus arctos. Of course, you know, your grizzly bear and our brown bears are subspecies of the same. Ursus arctos. You have Ursus arctos horribilis. This is Ursus arctos. As far as size and weight are concerned, they're not dissimilar to each other. The grizzlies are a touch larger than the European or Eurasian brown bear. But in Norway, there's about 2,500 of them, so 1,500 in Finland. And you would never just wander into a forest and come across them. They're very, very shy. And so these were photographed coming out of hibernation. In fact, these had only been out of hibernation for about a week or so. Prior to our arrival, the snow was so deep and it was so cold. So this is the middle, sort of latter part of April here, and snow in central northern Norway and Finland will remain until maybe the first or second week of June. And they have a very short summer there. So summer will go through obviously through till August, and then their autumn begins sort of second week of September. So snow here, very close to the Russian border, I guess about a kilometre from the Russian border, in fact. But these kind of hides, where you have these chimneys and heated hides, were invented by the Finns, actually. Before them, people were generally suffering in canvas hides and sort of rudimentary type blinds. But when photographing big game, I guess you could say, in terms of elk and brown bears in the winter, 40 or so years ago, they designed these hides with chimneys that come out from them, so that your scent would then be carried above the animal. Inside the hide, there's a little gas fire, so you keep nice and warm inside. And we get there by these sort of converted snowmobiles with a sledge on the back. And that in itself is really wonderful, you know, because it's a 15-minute ride through the most pristine forest, where we jump off, get into our hide. So you can just about see the snowmobile tracks there. So, you know, over that week-long period, I know there's this 10 to 12,000 steps they try to get you to do every day. Well, it's unlikely you'll do that in the week while you're there, because you literally walk from the accommodation onto the snowmobile to the hides, in the hide, and you're escorted in the hide, shall I say, sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It stays light enough for photography till about 9 p.m. and then light from about 4 a.m. and then you're let out of the hide again at about 8:30, 9 a.m. So you stay in there for about 14 hours, I guess. They're
Wow.
just about big enough for two people. There is the most basic of basic loos. So if you need to go, you overcome your shyness pretty quick. And my biggest tip for those that accompany me on such that are foolish enough to accompany me when photographing bears, I say is whatever you do, just overcome that shyness and keep drinking fluids, because you'll end up with cramp and dizzy spells if you don't. And the times when people, because they don't want to, relieve themselves, shall we say, in the
Yeah.
home, they have headaches and cramps, etc. You just have to, you just have to do what nature's telling you to do. Keep drinking and keep eating, and don't worry about it. So by the second night, nobody cares, and they just get on. Now, these things have to be spoken about, and when
Yeah.
you're photographing in the confines and you're sharing a hide with somebody, but yeah, having such an enormous animal fresh out of hibernation, occasionally with their young as well. Now they'll remain with the mother for 2.5 years, and they'll be born January, February time while in hibernation. But unlike, shall we say, bats and some smaller species of mammal, in the UK we have a tiny mammal called a dormouse. I don't know if you have it. Now they go into what we call proper hibernation, where they're completely sort of in a state of deep hibernation for about 6 months of the year. Bears, on the other hand, are tinkering on the edge, as it were, and even in the middle of winter, if the temperature rises a touch, they might awaken and go outside and look for a bit of food, and then they'll come back in again. So she'll have these during hibernation. But brown bears have something very similar to, in fact, identical to badgers, even, called delayed implantation. So they can mate any time the previous year, shall we say summer, July, August, which is prime mating time for bears. And then they will always give birth at the same time. Delayed implantation means that the egg isn't implanted into the uterus till the final 6 weeks or so, when normal pregnancy then takes place. So this is marvelous, because it means regardless of when they mate, the young are born always at the same time, and they come out in spring when there's more food around. So they'll remain with mother for sort of 2.5 years. And one of the first things they learn, of course, is how to climb a tree, to keep away from male bears, which, like lions, will quite readily kill cubs, so that female comes into estrus, and he can then mate with her. Now, this was a surprise encounter. Wolverine, far fewer in number in the Nordics, far fewer in number. And so to get these was even more of a treat than photographing the bears, actually. Gulo, or glutton, as they're called here in Europe, this capacity to consume so much food, and their strength as well. They've been known to take down animals as large as reindeer. They're the largest of the weasel family, so they're within the same family as badgers and stoats, but they're the largest. And they have this sort of gait, as it were, this sort of trot across the snow. But yeah, they're real scavengers, but will occasionally hunt and take food and put it in the tops of trees to keep it away from wolves and the such like.
Wow.
So for these images, I would have used the same equipment as I did for the grouse, same lens, 200 to 400. But it's such a heavy lens, that 200, 400. The 200 to 400 fitted to the D850 weighed in excess of 3 kilos, 3.2 kilos. And frankly, I kind of had enough of lugging around heavy equipment like that and taking it through airport security, etc. Whereas the Z8 and the 400 millimeter is half the weight. Cannot believe just how light that 400 millimeter f4.5 is. The 200 to 400, you're lucky if you can handhold it for any longer than, say, 30 seconds or a minute at a time. But the 400 Z lens is so light; it's a real pleasure to use. A lovely encounter on our last evening when photographing brown bears out of hibernation.
Joel and Marlene Wild.
Oops, that wasn't me.
That was me.
That's fine. That's fine. That's cool. As it started walking toward the camera, just keeping that. I often get asked as to what focusing method do I use when photographing animals like this as it's coming toward the camera. Well, nowadays you've got some eye detection, so that makes life a little bit easier. But generally, when I'm dealing with quite dark coloured animals where contrast is low, or at least on the animal. I like to keep things really simple. And so in this instance, I kept the focusing point in the centre of the frame between the eyes. Kept it really simple because I really had to nail this image. There's no way, you can't just, of course, ask the bear to reenact and to do it again if you muck it up. So, I've taken a meter reading from the snow. I've dialed in, let's say, 1,000th of a second at f4, moved that histogram right across until it's almost clipping. And then I just kept the focusing point on continuous autofocus as it's walking toward the camera. And fortunately, that whole sequence came out nice and sharp. Yes, it's really not something you want to get wrong when you have this marvelous opportunity as it's walking toward you. And so we're shifting the focus from the wildlife of the Nordics, specifically Norway, Sweden and Finland, to a cluster of just 18 islands situated between Scotland and Iceland, the Faroe Islands. This is a really unusual place in that often when you ask or when you tell people where it is that you've been, they kind of look at you with a sort of a quizzical look and shake their heads and have no idea exactly where it is that you're talking about. But the Faroes, like Iceland, I would say is unlike anywhere else that I've been. It's a completely unique environment. It's very mountainous. You feel enclosed. The weather is just wild beyond compare. And I thought Iceland was wild, but the Faroes is up a notch. And I've been fortunate enough to go there on quite a few occasions now since 2016, 2017, in the summer, in the spring, and in the autumn, and in late winter. And there is no wet or dry season. There is no cold season or warm season. There's very little difference between night and day temperatures. So even in June when I've been there, daytime temperatures fluctuated between 10 and 12 degrees, and the same for nighttime. It didn't drop at all. The tide is very, very slight. It differs only by about a meter or so compared to the usual 5 to 6 meters difference. But the weather there is really very extreme, but of course fantastic for outdoor photographers to be photographing wild seas and high cliffs. Some of the highest cliffs in the world are found in the Faroe Islands. The highest is in Norway, which is close on 800 meters. Imagine a cliff face, which is, sea cliffs anyway, which have to be close on vertical to be recognized as being a cliff at 800 meters high. But the highest in the Faroes is about 700 meters, but there are lots of them that reach that kind of height. The average is between sort of 300 and 700 meters. So you really are in a very wild place. This is a natural harbour, which you have to kind of laugh at when you see it. And you can only imagine fishermen coming in here on their small wooden rowing boats in the 18th and 19th century while the sea is pushing them up into this gully. The cliff that you can see here is known as Slave Cliff. Faroes, as I said, it comprises of 18 islands. Has a very small population of about, 25,000. So very, very small population. And what is so lovely about it is that you can drive for miles and be photographing in areas where there aren't any other photographers around. Indeed, any other people around, quite frankly. But this is known as Slave Cliff. Vikings discovered the Faroe Islands en route to Iceland. So they discovered it by mistake. So they inhabited the Faroe Islands, and it's called Slave Cliff because they would push slaves off the cliff. Simple as that, really. Now I don't mind heights, but these are really vertigo-inducing. These cliffs, they're absolutely sheer. There's no coming back from it if you happen to lose your footing. They're quite extraordinary to get so close. The witch's finger. There's all kinds of myths and legends surrounding a troll as she's fallen into the ocean, and this is known as a witch's finger. We had this wonderful moment of spotlight on this monolith, and being careful to just keep these two buildings in the bottom left-hand corner to add a sense of scale into the image. So I shot this using my Olympus, the OMD EM Mark III, at an equivalent of 300mm using image stabilization at, I think, a 30th of a second at 300mm. It's got fantastic image body IBIS, internal body image stabilization. And I think ISO, maybe shot at ISO 200 at f8. And, you know, if I had to get a tripod up, of course, I would have missed this image because the light was so fleeting. I do a lot of black and white photography as well, both digital and film. I'm currently working on a couple of projects using a Hasselblad with film cameras. I started with film and I process my own film as well. But when I'm shooting digital, often I'll shoot in the desired aspect ratio that I enjoy, which might be 5:4 or 1:1 aspect, and convert into a black and white. I enjoy the whole process of pre-visualization and processing in black and white. And the Faroe Islands suits black and white just superbly, I think. This is the Faroes' tallest waterfall, Fossa waterfall. Very wild day. There's just no way that we could set up a tripod here. So we're sheltering from the minibus actually while photographing this. And sometimes it's the details, the almost, I'm not sure if you would quite class this as being the intimate landscape, but certainly just details within the landscape, rather than trying to put on a wide angle lens and encapsulate everything. As much, if not more, can be said by really homing in on a small area. As this case here, when actually photographing from the minibus window, with the window down, but shooting from an elevated position down onto the fjord. I just absolutely adore these kind of conditions. And as I say, I'm very fortunate to live, you know, reasonably close really to places like Iceland and the Faroe Islands, where this is quite commonplace, having such wild conditions. A final series of pictures just depicting Finland in summer. So come middle to latter part of June, Norway, Sweden and Finland actually, when the sun, at least in the middle to latter part of June, doesn't drop below the horizon. It's a time when your days are inverted, when you're out photographing plants at 1 o'clock in the morning and landscapes at that time. And it's not unusual also to have snowfall as well, in this case here of a mountain hare waiting to cross the road. I was staying in quite a remote cabin near Russia, actually. It was +20 a few days previous, so +20 degrees centigrade. And then overnight it went down to about -6. And we had 6 to 8 inches of snow, which gave some wonderful opportunities. Who would have thought it, you know, first week of June, actually. And a few inches of snow lay on the ground and gave me some lovely opportunities to photograph the birds there, including this bullfinch. Moon rising over taiga forest, that belt of forest, which I'm sure you're familiar with, or at least have heard of, that stretches from sort of Canada to Scandinavia and Russia. Brown bear at sunrise, or at dawn rather. We just, fingers crossed each morning for these kind of conditions. So similarly to in the spring, we're in the hide from 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But when you're photographing in the latter part of June, well, when you're that far north, then it never really gets dark. So we're able to photograph through the night. But if there's a clear spell, very still conditions, then of course we hope that we're going to get conditions such as this. And at dawn also. They're attracted close to the hide. I say attracted, but they're kind of fed tidbits, I guess. So there's no way that enough food can ever be put out for these bears. So they rely solely on it. So I guess you could put it similar to, I guess, putting out food for your birds. You know, of course, the peanuts and the seed which you put out for them is never going to replace their proper diet of insects and the such like, which contains far more nutrients, but they visit your bird table anyway. And that's the same for this, really. There's just no way otherwise that you'd be in the hide in the hope that a bear would come across from Russia or from Norway, shall we say, you know, in front of your hide close enough. So a little bit of food, some scraps is put out in the swamp or in the or in the forest area, and it's just enough to pique the interest of these animals. Oops, go back to that. It was incredibly hot last year. So these hides are primarily built for winter and spring photography. So they're wooden, but have metal exteriors, sort of metal tin roofs rather. So as you can imagine, on a really hot summer's afternoon, by the time you get into it, it's like an oven. So ambient temperature was about 30 degrees. In the hide, I measured 54 degrees in the hide. So we were kind of just sitting there until night fell, when the temperature would drop a couple of degrees and there'll be a slight breeze coming in through the portholes. But that bear was doing something that we all hoped we could do. Quite frankly, it was so hot in there. Take a bath, and
floor would be 130 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit. Wow.
Yeah, so you're pretty much just sitting there in your in your shorts. It's so warm, but worth it, of course, when you get these animals so close to you that are swimming and bathing in front of you in that pond. And one has to suffer for such privileged experiences. Sub-adult, so the males here, these would have been last year's adults, perhaps even the year before that. When they're just testing their strength, they're most likely brothers, just when they're starting to get this kind of hierarchy, as it were, and test each other's strength out. And when it kicks off on the swamp, it's really good fun to watch, and of course to photograph as well. But it's not just all about bears. We have to capitalize on situations that present themselves, regardless of what they are. I guess, like a lot of nature photographers, I'm drawn not just by the animal, but by the quality of light. I'd much rather photograph a common species in beautiful light and conditions than I would a very rare species in terrible light and in an environment that doesn't really suit my style of photography particularly. And this is a very, very common gull species called a black-headed gull. So we get them all over the place here in the UK. You see them by the beach, you see them in woodlands, you see them everywhere really. But I just couldn't resist it when it was backlit beautifully against the cotton grass. And using similar low-level hides as I did for the grouse as well. It's a long time to spend in a laying down hide, 14 hours, but again, it gives you that low-level perspective, which provides that intimacy. Okay, so end of part one. If you don't mind, if we can come back in 10 minutes time for the second part, that would be good.
Yep, that'll work out fine. We'll take a short break, everybody, and
Okay.
you want to bring out some questions, and when we get started in 5 or 10 minutes here, 10 minutes here, we'll ask you some questions in that. So
all right, I'll see you in about 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So hopefully everybody's enjoying this so far. Some really fascinating stuff.
This is kind of a perspective that we haven't seen, Jeff. I mean, we've had Iceland, and we've had speakers for areas like that. This really introduces a whole different view to that.
The low-level perspective is great. Most of us can probably get down, but some of us need a plan on how to get back up.
Yep. Yeah, that would be definitely tricky.
Yeah, when my wife and I were in Kenya, we stayed at a place that was near a watering hole that was probably an acre in size, the watering hole, and the whole hotel was built on sticks up about 10 feet, so the wildlife could walk under the hotel. And then they had a tunnel that went closer to the water hole with a slit where you could be right at the hoof level of many of these animals. When they were close, you had that low perspective, so you're looking up at the animals. It was really interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, I have a friend
No.
that in Canada, a photographer that goes to Africa and shoots in some of the hoods like that are close to the ground. And she's got some of the pictures of the elephants from the water level looking up like that. And you're right, they are just amazing pictures.
Yeah, it's a good point of view, different point of view. Because we don't always get that low. I'm not a good one for getting low. I tend to shoot at 6 foot level. So
I had never thought of the advantage of shooting at, you know, such a low level as far as depth of field.
yeah,
That's something I never thought of. That's really a good point.
yep. No, this has been interesting. I'm glad I found this guy. Actually, he found us. He had sent us an email saying, I'm giving these different talks. If you're interested, be glad to do it. So,
Dan
That's
Anderson
fun.
went to the Faroe Islands and had a workshop there. My wife and I, Marie and I, signed up for it, but the COVID surge came about, 6 months ahead, and we canceled. But friends of ours went along, and they've got some phenomenal photos. They went in April, and it snowed for a little while, so they got snow all over, and then a couple days later, no snow, and it's green, and it's like he was saying. The weather is, wild out there. They said it was super windy too. But beautiful stuff.
Yeah, it's I know the area is great, so very interesting. I've had a number of friends that have traveled over that way and talk about it, and so no, this is pretty good.
Faroe Islands are becoming a popular hotspot for photographers, but you gotta like fog and overcast and gray. That seeing some of the pictures, you get that one moment of sunlight beaming through, and it creates some amazing pictures.
Well, I'm always a fog and overcast day guy, so
So you really like it. I want to
Yeah.
ask him if he's ever been to Svalbard. I'm kind of wanting to go to Svalbard, which is further up north.
My wife and I were there 6 months ago, and it's really kind of a desolate area, but the wildlife, the birds, and just incredible. And yeah, we had a tour there, and I think that's where we were at a research station. And we had to shut off all devices because it would interfere with these multi-country research stations in the area. But yeah, very, very interesting scenery and wildlife, bird life.
Trying to find the next one speaker that I've got coming in April, and then I'm also looking for I got Ken Bowman's asking about the spring competition. For 2024, nature is flowers and open is sunrise and sunset. So everybody get ready with your flowers for the Wacko Spring competition, and open is sunrise and sunset. In fall, it's nature birds and open portraits, just in case anybody's interested. Yeah.
You showed that photo of a wolverine,
Yeah.
which I've always been fascinated by. We got a picture on our trail camera up in Door County of an animal that looks just like a wolverine, but it's a fisher. And it just moved into our area. We used to have a lot of porcupines up there in northern Door, and they've been disappearing the last few years ever since these fishers have moved in, because it turns out they're the only predator of a porcupine. They know how to flip them over and get at their stomach where they're, they don't have quills. But every time I show, the photo, to friends or somebody who might be interested, I said, you know what this is? And they say, oh, it looks like a wolverine, but it's a fisher. I think it's the second largest weasel.
Boy, interesting.
We told the farmer next door, because he's been losing chickens and ducks and things. We told him, we'd got the photo, and he said, oh, let me see it. He said, if you ever see it again, let me know. I'll bring my gun. And he means it.
Yeah. Yeah, the photographer I've got hopefully coming in April is a Gregory Holden. And he's going to talk about how to see in black and white. So trying to come up with a lot of different people, and he had some interesting black and white stuff, and thought that would be a good talk.
You've been doing a good job with that, Jeff.
Huh?
Good job. You've been really getting some nice speakers up here.
Yeah,
Excellent.
We're finding some different ones at least, and it's been interesting coming up with them. That's where the Zoom has made things so handy. It's get a guy from Europe where it's 4:00 in the afternoon there, so we can still get them from Europe and still have a decent time zone for them for this early morning for us. And got a couple others I'll be working on. So there he is.
Thank you.
Robert, we got one question. Is there any advice for someone planning a trip to Iceland? Understand the volcanic activity is hot.
Yeah,
so.
No, that's on all our minds at the moment. I've got a trip there in February, and my colleagues are all kind of a little bit on tenterhooks, wondering what on earth is going to happen. But as far as advice is concerned, what you mean, equipment, clothing, or what?
Yeah,
What kind of advice are you
I'm
after?
not sure. It's just something that Dan, Al, if you want to add a little more to your question. Let's see if you
Expect the unexpected, and go with you've got to manage your expectations with Iceland. Things happen, as in roads get closed, you can't get to your accommodation, or at least the one that you've booked at, and you kind of just have to have the attitude that what happens happens. In the winter, if you're going in winter, which is the most popular time, do be aware that unless you're quite an experienced winter driver, it can be quite nasty, to say the least. 100-mile-per-hour winds, complete whiteouts. And if you are going to travel by car, spend a little bit extra on getting yourself a good four-wheel drive. So at least then, even if you're on a main road, you feel a little more secure. There's been occasions when I have a guide that does my driving for me in Scandinavia, that I fly over to Iceland, because although he's actually a Dutch national, he's lived and worked in Finland as a wilderness guide and professional driver for the last 20 years. So I fly him over to Iceland, so he does the driving for me. And quite frankly, he drives with aplomb in the sort of conditions where I would be a gibbering wreck, quite frankly. But if you're going to Iceland, autumn's a lovely time of the year to go. Don't discount autumn, and you'll still have an excellent chance to see the Northern Lights. So if you go in late September and October, that's a lovely time to go, when you're not going to get the kind of hard conditions that you might experience in winter. So don't discount autumn if you're looking for the Northern Lights and that kind of Icelandic experience. Any time of the year is well worth visiting, but just kind kind of go with the flow is the best kind of advice I can give, because it's as much when you're traveling your mental attitude as it is the gear and the clothing that you've got with you. You know, there are going to be times, as I said, when you can't reach the location that you want to go to. So you kind of just think, okay, never mind, I'll see what I can get a bit closer to where I am.
Sure.
But as far as clothing is concerned, then I guess it's no different to what you would probably don, you know, where you are when the temperatures really go. Albeit it's probably a little bit different there. I don't know, because you're near the coast. So a good outer shell is a prerequisite, a really good waterproof outer shell, and some ice grips for your boots, because it can obviously be very slippery there as well. Yeah, Iceland, along with the Faroes, they trip you up on occasion. They just sort of, nature has a way of reminding you who's boss, you know. I've been to the Faroes in April, and actually in October, when I came back in October. It never snows apparently in April and October. Well, we had 6 to 12 inches of it, and got stuck up a mountain pass.
Oh boy.
But
Yeah.
you know, you work out a way and you get over it, and you ring a number, or you get somebody local to pull you out, and actually all that kind of adds to the adventure. It's all part of the adventure and the experience, and I think that's
Sure.
kind of that's the attitude you've got to have when you go somewhere like that.
Yeah. Sounds like an interesting place to go.
Fascinating. Yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, you'll be seeing some pictures of Iceland anyway, so
I
Great.
haven't seen a
That's
lot
coming
of
up.
wildlife photography out of Iceland. Most people go there, I think, to shoot the landscape photography.
Yeah. There's some. It's particularly good for birds. I mean, the Faroe Islands is all seabirds really. I mean, they don't have much in the way of smaller birds, because it's such a sort of barren interior. In fact, they only have 3 species of mammal on the Faroe Islands. Sort of the mountain hare, the rat, and the house mouse, and that's it. But Iceland, yeah, has some really fabulous bird communities in Iceland. Lake Mýrdalur, which is in the very north central part of Iceland, is particularly good for redneck pharaoh and duck species that nest up there. So yeah, I mean there are lots of birds there. Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah, great for volcanoes, but the volcanoes have been so close to the airport. It's kind of scary to know whether you're gonna get flights deferred from.
No, that's right.
The last day or so, they've been saying the earthquakes in that Grindavik, I think is the town, they've been settling down.
Yeah, well, you actually land in Keflavik, and it's near the Blue Lagoon, which is a very famous spa place where people kind of, you know, bathe in these sort of hot springs. So what they are saying about this volcano is, if it does erupt, then apparently it's not the same as the volcano about 10 years ago, which disrupted all air travel, even across Europe. This one's similar in that it's not expected to release the kind of quantities of ash that would disrupt flight travel that the previous one done. But you know, it's a natural thing, and who knows what's going to happen and when and to what kind of ferocity, who knows. So yeah, just have to see how things go, see how it pans out. You know, if it happens a few days before we leave, then so be it. It's just all part of it.
They've evacuated Grindavik, and dug huge trenches around the power plant, which isn't too far, but it's the power plant. Actually, the Blue Lagoon is the effluent from the power plant. And they've dug huge trenches to catch lava, in case that would be the case if it starts approaching the power plant.
Yeah.
It's getting pretty serious there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
it might not erupt at all. Like I said, the last couple of days, the earthquakes have settled down, and they're beginning to question whether it's going to erupt at all.
Yeah.
But it does have some beautiful photography when those volcanoes do erupt.
Oh yes, I mean that would be amazing if actually. I say, of course, we always look at the right side photographers. I mean, it would be amazing if something did happen and you could still get there and photograph it, and we could maybe spend some time photographing that as well as the usual places. So it would be really incredible. But of course, you've really got to feel for those poor residents that have been evacuated. and they kind of just, I know they've been able to go back intermittently to get stuff, but still to be away from your home and all your belongings and be on a knife edge really without any kind of
Yeah.
any knowing as to when or as to whatever's going to happen. Who knows?
Yeah.
We'll see.
Screwy. Crazy.
Please.
All right. Well, that's all the questions we really had. So we can continue on. Hubert did put in the formula for centigrade to Fahrenheit for anybody that is interested in doing the math.
Yeah, good.
Or there's an app for that, of course.
My favorite temperature is -40 because it's the same in Celsius as it is in Fahrenheit.
That's interesting. -40. Okay, all right. Yeah, I've only been that low once in northern Finland, -40, and interesting temperature.
I don't think I'd want to be in it.
As to your camera gear at -40.
Yeah, nothing works well at -40.
No, humans or equipment. No, you're right.
Nope.
No. Yeah, well. All right.
I like to memorize 28 degrees because 28 Celsius is 82 Fahrenheit. There's another thing that
that's a good one.
Little helper.
It's a good one. It's a good one. Yeah. Okay, so let's share the screen again. Okay, and go to autumn.
Looks good.
So, needless to say, autumn for photographers is a bountiful time, or at least we hope so. But from one year to the next, we know not the state of the colour and whether there'll be many leaves on the trees. We haven't had a great autumn this year. It's come incredibly late. Usually our autumn occurs, at least here in the southeast England, sort of third week of October to the second week of November, but we're really getting very, very little colour until the second week of November. It's very late, and we've had a lot of strong winds, a lot of rain. So today, really, when we had some beautiful frosty conditions and still some autumn colour on the trees, had me out at pre-dawn, shall we say, to be on location. It was a lovely few hours to be out photographing. And as wonderful as it is where I live, photographing in the woodlands, nothing, at least in my experience, has ever compared to the Nordics in autumn, particularly Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, because the aspen and birch are just, of course, just fill the landscape with yellow, and the ground vegetation filled with the red leaves of northern bilberry and bunchberry. And so this is a view from Finland looking across to Norway. I've been leading trips to Finnish and Norwegian Lapland now since 2012, both in the autumn and winter. And whenever I take a group to northern Finland, to Lapland, so about 100 miles within the Arctic Circle, I guess, we always visit this quite small sort of nature trail, I guess. Without taking photos, you could do the circular route, I guess, in an hour, but with camera equipment and with all of this subject matter around us, usually 4 to 6 hours is more appropriate. You're just surrounded by the most beautiful scenery and untouched wilderness as well. There's no deforestation that happens in this part of the world where I take my clients. And so much of it is as it's been for many, many hundreds of years. So ancient stands of conifer and aspen, silver birch, rowan tree as well, obviously produce this wonderful kaleidoscope of colour. But in terms of camera equipment for this kind of more sort of sedentary form of photography, whereas wildlife tends to be somewhat more high octane, where you have action lasting for short periods, but nevertheless you're working with fast long lenses and fast shutter speeds, etc. The mindset, let alone the equipment, is very different when photographing scenes like this, where there isn't any hurry. And in any of my workshops, I much prefer to spend longer periods on location and at fewer locations rather than, you know, sort of dotting from one place to the next. It's quite an assault on your senses, of course, when you visit an area like this and there's so much colour, so much subject matter. It would be terrible for me to turn around to everybody and say, by the way, you've got an hour, and then we're off somewhere else. So instead, we spend 4 to 6 hours in a place where, and there's no more than 6 of us as well. And any of my tours, there's never any more than 6 people. So you're not sort of rubbing shoulders with other photographers. You can all find your little place. And I then just go to everybody in turn to see how they're getting on and let them create their own photographs, but always knowing that I'm nearby and help with any advice or whether it be technical or otherwise. But with this kind of work, it tends to be more the advice that I tend to give tends to be not so much technical, because I think most people can grasp the technique of photography, the ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and lens, what lens to use, etc. But it's more the aesthetics, it's the artistry of photography, I think, which so many people tend to find the most problematic. And indeed, those which have more of an art background, I found grasp photography far easier and far more quickly than those which are very technique based. Because those that already have a creative eye can see these photographs far more quickly than somebody who is more technical, shall we say, and needs just a little more time to get their eye in. High up in Lapland in the Nordics, this is more sort of typical Lappish scenery. Those areas with lots of coniferous trees, the taiga forests, and streams and swamps is, although regarded as being within Lapland, for me this is real Lapland country, where it's made up of rock and bilberry and dwarf birch, where you'll get bears and wolverine and reindeer roaming an area such as this. It's quite an interesting fact that the white-throated dipper is a natural bird of Norway, but more that has a landmass of 385,000 square kilometres. So that's very similar to Finland. So both in terms of size and population, imagine that, 385,000 square kilometres, but with a population of just 5.4 million. Now the UK has a landmass of about 250,000 square kilometres, but with a population of 62 million. Okay, so we have a country 100,000 square kilometers less, but with more than 10 times the population of Norway and Finland. And it's little wonder why Finland often is at the top of the charts with the happiest country in the world. They have so much space, and the Scandinavian way of life is very much outdoor oriented. As far as the Finns are concerned, they love their saunas. You know, it's like the Brits going to a pub. For the Finns, they spend, you know, every day in a sauna, spring, summer, autumn, winter. There are more saunas than there are people in Finland, for example, which is quite a statistic. They invented skiing 4,000 years ago. There are 400,000 lakes in Norway. And on a routine voyage to the Faroes, the Vikings discovered Iceland by accident. So having all of this space with a small population, most of which only reside in the larger towns and cities, there's little wonder. And given that they have a law in Scandinavia called every man's rights, which means that regardless of where you are, as long as it's not a private property, somebody's front garden, you can park your car, grab a backpack, and head off into the wilderness. There are no barriers, there are no boundaries, there's no private, no footpaths, no footpath signs. You can just head off. And they have a system of cabins and lean-to shelters, which is quite frankly, it's superb. I've stayed in them on numerous occasions, and you'll come across a cottage, maybe a day's walk from the nearest road, and there'll be a bed, there'll be blankets, there'll be fresh firewood, there'll be an axe and a broom, and it's immaculate and it's unlocked, so you can use it as you'd like. You know, you can use it as and when you'd like, only for a day or two. And something which you'll always notice as well, which I had to ask when I first noticed it, and that is, you'll often see as soon as you enter the cabin, a box of excuse me, my frog mitter. Excuse me. You will see a box of matches with a match sticking out of the matchbox. And that's so if somebody comes in frostbitten, they can still grab a match and strike it with their knuckles. They're coming in from the wilderness. They're just little tiny things like this. There's food there. You'll find packets of soup and drink, etc., just in case you want to use it. And it's such a wonderful system of cabins and lean-to shelters in Scandinavia that you can quite easily travel around for quite some periods, just occasionally heading into towns to stock up. Many hundreds of thousands of reindeer throughout Lapland, and reindeer husbandry has been taking place by the Samis, that nomadic people of Lapland for more than 2,000 years. And these are obviously a very common occurrence whilst you're in the Nordics, but particularly Scandinavia. Often the only remnants that you will see on occasion might be a skeleton of a reindeer, perhaps footprints of wolverine and bear. But it's somewhere that I would say almost am my happiest when I'm in Scandinavia, particularly Lapland, and when I'm hiking and you're away from sort of crowds of people, as it were, and I'm generally on my own, and I have all this space at my disposal, and I'm able just to put up a tent and then move on further still. It's very, very freeing, and this kind of wide open space feel that you get in Lapland is something which is very, very good for the soul as well, of course. When you're somewhere like that. So into Norway, into the coastal fjords of Norway, more specifically just to the north of the Lofoten Islands, which is quite famous, well, very famous, in fact. Indeed, if a photographer heads to Norway, chances are they're going to the Lofoten Islands, where they have these beautiful, picturesque fishing huts, red fishing huts on the edges of fjords, and maybe if they're lucky enough at night they'll get the dancing northern lights above it as well. But just to the north of the Lofoten Islands is the smaller, more compact Senja. So Senja is a wilder sort of cousin, I guess you could say, of the Lofoten Islands. And this is one spot which I take my group to on more than one occasion. We usually visit at least 3 times. It's called the Devil's Teeth, Tungeneset. The mountains in the distance, Tungeneset, this is seen at dawn. And it's such an awesome coastal location that it would be a travesty to just take them on the once. Yeah, we visit on numerous occasions. The beautiful geometry and patterns in the rocks here lend itself so nicely to photography, particularly with a wide angle lens. For this kind of work, my pack consists of a 14mm 2.8 lens for astrophotography. So that's a straight 14mm, an 18-35, a 50mm, and a 70-200mm with a 1.4 converter. I use a tripod as much as I possibly can. So I use a carbon fiber Manfrotto tripod with a large ball and socket head. And when I can't exposure blend and I'm using ND filters, I'll often use graduated filters as well, made by Lee. So I use a selection of Lee ND graduated filters, polarizing filter as well, of course. Yeah, generally my go-to lens with this kind of scene is an 18-35mm lens. And if I can, I like to get the image done in one as opposed to focus stack. And furthermore, if I can apply a graduated filter as opposed to image exposure blend, I'd rather do that as well. I think there's an enormous amount of satisfaction that derives from doing it all in camera and seeing the resultant image on the back of your camera or through the viewfinder, however you view your images, whether it be mirrorless or DSLR, as opposed to relying on the computer when you get home. Much like multiple exposure, if I'm working on multiple exposure, intentional camera movement, I do it in camera. I don't like to do it on a computer, because it's while I'm photographing that I'm in the mood and I'm in the zone and I have this feeling of what I want to create, and not in a, well, dare I say, quite a sterile environment of an office looking at a screen where you don't get quite the feel as you would elsewhere. Sunrise. If I were to take one lens when photographing the landscape, it would be my zoom lens. It would be my telephoto zoom lens, preferably one that goes to 300 or 400mm, more so than much rather have a telephoto even than a wide angle lens. With a wide angle, you know, you're really, I think, limited in your potential as to what you can photograph, because you know you're incorporating more often than not the sky, middle distance, and foreground. But with a telephoto, you can pick out those smaller parts in the landscape. And the Nordics, the Faroes, Norway, Sweden, etc., just lend themselves beautifully to this kind of imagery of glancing light on a mountain covered in silver birch. Ancient pine trees and swamp. And rowan tree. With some of these images, I've even had to reduce the saturation on some of them, because it is so colorful somewhere like that. And I want to retain the neutrality of the scene, or at least I want to retain the color of the scene, but not to go too over the top. So I even have to reduce the saturation sometimes. This kind of photography, as you'll appreciate, when you're photographing in woodlands, it can be, and I've used this phrase before, an assault on your senses, and you're making sense out of nature's chaos, aren't you? With all kinds of trunks and branches and twigs in the way. It's finding a flow through the scene, I guess you could say, where you and where separation becomes a key component, where not everything is merging into one another, but there is cohesion of the various elements within the frame, that where your eye, I guess, kind of just rests, and it's not darting from one corner to the other. The same applies when I'm processing a photo. When I'm halfway through, I'll turn the photo upside down. So I no longer see it as an image, but I see it as a range of tones. And it's much easier to spot dark and excessively dark and light areas when you turn a picture upside down than it is to see it the right way up. Indeed, it's a practice that painters have been using for centuries, but very easy for us to do in Lightroom, just turning it upside down and then evaluating the image each time. Bunchberry. So a lot of my natural history photography, particularly in when I was some years ago, in my 20s and 30s, evolved around close-up and macro photography. And I have a real love of nature in miniature, I guess you could say. So today, for example, I was out photographing close-ups of ferns and frost-covered leaves. And I gain a great deal of pleasure from photographing the small stuff, I guess you could say, in the natural world, and not just incorporating all the big things that we see around us, but the smaller things, such as this cluster of berries of bunchberry. And so for this, I would have used my 70 to 200 millimeter, one of two ways, but the most common method I use is by using a very high quality close-up well, it's actually a close-up lens, but it acts like, it screws on the front of the lens like a filter. But it's actually a close-up lens, which come in different strengths or diopter strengths. Mine is made by Canon. Nikon don't make them to the same thread diameter. And it's a 2-element close-up lens, which means that if I travel abroad, I have a very small macro lens, really, in the form of a filter, really, that kind of screws on the front of the lens, and where there's no loss in quality. And it enables my 70 to 200 to photograph very small things as well, without the need to take a macro lens or extension tubes with me. On a research trip that I took to Norway, I spent 9, maybe 10 days on my own, visiting the various places that I potentially wanted to take a group, but it was mixed. Every day it was blue sky without so much as a cloud in the sky, which for photographers is pretty awful, quite frankly, to wake up to blue skies. In the middle of the day is blue sky. You've got all this beautiful color, aspen and birch, and you can't do anything with it because it's so bright and sunny. But the upshot to that is that I had clear skies every night, and I had the most amazing display of northern lights on 6 consecutive occasions. And the beauty as well of this particular island is that there were no other photographers around, dare I say any other people. I was spending time alone in the mountains and in vantage points with nobody around, and that's really quite something when you get to experience a phenomenon like the Northern Lights, but to be on your own as well. I mean, it's wonderful to have a group with you and to experience what you're seeing, but there's something very sort of spiritual, I guess you could say, of being surrounded by the dancing lights of the Aurora Borealis, when you're surrounded by beautiful mountain scenery and you can't see or hear anything else other than this natural phenomenon. And on to Iceland. It would be foolish of me not to include images of Iceland in the Nordic, in a talk on the Nordics, given just how popular they are amongst photographers. And I know this has come as a bit of a double-edged sword amongst some photographers, in that they feel as though they know Iceland so well that perhaps they're not really keen on visiting it, or maybe be too busy and it's not really something they want to experience. But my advice has always been that nothing, just go, because nothing can really prepare you for what you're about to experience, quite frankly. Iceland is just amazing. It's a landscape like the Faroe Islands, which is completely unique, like nowhere else I've ever been to. The weather can change on the sixpence. It's a saying here in the UK, in that it can just turn. If you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes, and chances are, or just turn the corner to another fjord, and it will be very, very different. The Scandinavians have a great saying that there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. So you really do have to dress for the weather, as it were. So lots of layers, good quality boots, and expect the unexpected. Glaciers, mountains, wild seas, and the national bird of landmass now with Iceland. It's a population of 372,000. Before the arrival of the Vikings, it was 20 to 40% of it was forested, which I find remarkable with Iceland. To think that a country, as you drive around it, pretty much has no trees at all, but at one time it was almost half of it was forested. But it's quite incredible. 30 to 40% of Icelanders believe in elves. Okay, I guess all you can do with that is shake your head, quite frankly. And the oldest and longest-running parliament in the world started in 930 in Iceland, 300 years before Parliament in England. So I just love sort of random facts like that with the various countries that I visit. Vestrahorn Mountains, the Black Sand Beach and the Vestrahorn Mountains is probably my favourite place to visit in Iceland and to photograph. Again, it's very wild, and the light here was, gosh, it was difficult on the one hand because it was very high contrast, incredibly wild because you have these rogue waves that come up, these freakish waves that will be 20, 30 meters away from you. And then all of a sudden you'll have a wave that comes up and in some cases can sweep people off their feet. Every year there are, very sadly, not an insubstantial amounts of lives lost by Iceland's waves that take people off their feet and drag them in. These freakish waves can really catch you out, and as it takes you out, all of a sudden the bottom, so to speak, kind of drops away from you. So it doesn't just gradually slope; it suddenly drops to many, many meters deep. So you really do have to keep your wits about you. Always keep your camera bag on your back. A colleague of mine told me a story where, although he told a client of his to do just that, he failed to do so. And the next thing he saw was his camera bag disappearing off into the distance towards Greenland, sort of floating off into the distance. And this stuff happens, So you're always keeping your camera bag on your back and keeping watch of each other, and especially of these rogue waves. Now, when photographing high contrast scenes like that, not necessarily in this image, a slow exposure image of waves, I like to use handheld HDR, handheld bracketing. And that's really saved my bacon when photographing high contrast situations where you can't use filters. Perhaps it's very windy and there's lots of silt spray. You definitely can't use a tripod because there's wind gusts of 40 to 70 miles per hour, perhaps. So you're having to work handheld. Is to set the camera to 3 shots, handheld, 3 stops bracket. So I'm doing one picture of what the camera's recommending, another 3 stops under, 3 stops over. And then I can merge them afterwards in Lightroom. And this is a really effective way of working in situations where the dynamic range falls beyond what the camera can handle, but you still need to be able to record it in camera. And it's a technique I use very, very often in Iceland when the weather's doesn't enable you to use a tripod or contemplate the use of filters. So this image would have been made using a shutter speed, I guess, of about 1/15 of a second. And as is so often the case when you're doing intentional camera movement or slow shutter speed photography, you can take dozens and dozens of photographs, which invariably I do when I'm trying to create photos like this. But it always tends to be the first one or two that catch your eye. I don't know whether that's because you're going by gut instinct and it's just happening. And the more you try at something, perhaps it's not quite coming off. But I love the effect that you get when photographing the coast with slow shutter speed. So I live, as I said, in quite near London, so in between London and Canterbury, where centre of the Anglican Church, of course. So very close to the North Kent coast. So within 10 minutes to my north, I have some beautiful coastline, and the same distance to the south, I'm in some lovely English countryside where there are woodlands and cottages and things like that. So very lucky, really, in that. Most of my photography, my private work anyway, has been undertaken within, let's say, a 20-minute drive of where I live. I'd say almost 80% of all my work has been undertaken within a maximum of 30 minutes, so that I can be somewhere close and having that almost encyclopedic knowledge of close to home locations, which you can't really do if your favourite places are a day's drive away, for example, or at least it's harder to do. Diamond Beach, Jökulsárlón. Where do you start when you're confronted with a scene like that at sunrise, with so many shards of icebergs that lay in front of you, particularly if you head towards one like this on the shore, and then you hope to photograph it, and then just as you get your tripod set up, a wave comes up and it washes it into the ocean. So you have to be pretty quick when you're photographing subjects like that, but needless to say, it provides boundless opportunities for the photographer. I spent almost an hour just photographing the close-ups of these shards of ice that lay strewn on this black sand beach. And although, Jökulsárlón, the ice lagoon, is popular, it's on the main south road, quite touristic. You get coach loads of people sometimes turning up. And it's a little bit disheartening if you turn up at the car park and there's 3 or 4 coaches and 30 or 40 cars. But then if you're prepared to walk more than 200 meters, you're on your own. The world is full of Instagrammers that wear inappropriate clothing when you go to the Nordics. So fear not, as long as you're wearing good boots and a warm jacket, hat and gloves, and are prepared to walk further than 400 meters, 400 yards, 400 meters, you will be on your own. This is, as I say, this was a 10, maybe 15-minute walk from the main car park, but it's in the opposite direction of where everybody else was happening. And I spent a fabulous 2 or 3 hours, just myself and a couple of members of the group, photographing these shards of ice as they're floating down towards the open sea. So that was captured using a 14mm prime lens. And blending the exposure afterwards. So I was able to expose for the shadows, the mid-tones, and then the highlights, and then blend them afterwards. Now, there's no movement in this scene, so there wasn't a problem, which of course would have been the case if there was swaying patches of vegetation. But with a still image like this, blending exposures, for me, is the way to go. And Lightroom makes it so easy as well. Lots of opportunities for compositions or incorporating almost a monochromatic film, I guess you could say, minimalist, where you can place the main subject small in the frame and incorporating lots of white and dark in the frame. It really is quite a country, and one which, even if you don't consider yourself to be much of a landscape photographer, there is so much subject potential out there and so much inspiration that you can't help but be impressed. So from an elevated perspective, what you see there is the black sand, the surf on the top left, and land on the right hand side, and then just waiting for a fulmar, which is actually in the albatross family, not a member of the gull family, but in the albatross family. And so really it's just a matter of waiting for a bird to fly in that gap. Heavy snow forced us to remain in the same hotel for more than 24 hours. I had to cancel the next base. There was no way we were going to reach it. And we had a 4-wheel drive minibus, but we had, I guess, almost 12 inches of snow in less than 4 hours. So that stopped everything in their tracks. And even though there were snow plows out, as soon as they were plowing the snow, it was the road was blocked again. So it's not uncommon for you to have to just ring ahead and say, sorry, we can't come, we're spending another day here, and replan. That's all part of it when you travel somewhere like the Faroes or Iceland or Greenland, I guess, is that you have to go with the flow and be prepared to make changes. But it did give us the opportunity to wander around the grounds of the hotel and photograph other compositions, which isn't such a bad thing when all said and done. Reynisfjara Beach. This is the one that surprises so many folk with their rogue waves that suddenly come screaming up the beach faster than you can run. It's very soft, sinking sand. And why people come here in January wearing trainers and leather coats and, as I say, completely inappropriately dressed, and then do a selfie with our back to waves like that, and then are surprised that they're caught out. Yeah, you really do have to wonder sometimes, of course, of the human race when they're put here. And there are signs all over the beach saying, "Beware! This beach kills people." It says that as plain as day. So you really do have to be careful. And shooting it in color at sunrise, of course, it displays the wild ferocity of the place. Shoot it in black and white, on the other hand. And you get a very different feel of the place. Long exposure, so with a 10-stop filter, converting to black and white, and furthermore as a square aspect ratio as well. Similarly with this scene here from the opposite side of the bay at sunrise. But then later on in the day when we returned, I love doing black and white for various reasons, but I think it's because it gives you more artistic license than color. With black and white, because you're already far removed from the norm, you don't really have to, as you do with color, to remain traditional in your processing. If you go a little bit crazy with the sliders in black and white, nobody really cares, because with black and white you're already producing a photograph that is away from the norm, from the traditional. But with color, if you ramp up your sliders and you produce a photograph that is that is very contrasty and very colorful, people immediately notice it. And so I love that about black and white. And also, with black and white, you can't hide behind color. If you have a glorious sunrise or sunset, people might forget, or rather forgive you for slightly sloppy composition. You can't do that with black and white. Everything has to be just so. Like close-up photography, there's no hiding behind a close-up photograph. It's either not right or wrong, but small imperfections stand out. So I love that about black and white. I can produce perhaps a very simple looking scene, but it also gives me lots more creative potential, I think, than color photography. The highlands of Iceland, perhaps in the far north, or in this case here, the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. Even wilder, I would say, than the south. No real main roads in the western fjords, but dramatic sea stacks and arches and lava fields and Icelandic ponies. Black Church of Buddha, Kirkjufell, Wizard's Hat Mountain, most famous mountain in Iceland. It's funny, really, because where you only get the Wizard's Hat perspective from one position. If you drive a few hundred meters in either direction, you'll notice that actually the crest is quite long, and it's only pointed from one angle. So you wouldn't you don't realize you're approaching it until you're almost on top of it, shall we say, and then you suddenly glance to your right and you see, oh, there it is, there's Wizard's Hat Mountain. But it's north facing, and I'm yet to photograph it under the northern lights. So one day perhaps, one day perhaps that'll happen. Who knows? Speaking of which, we're going to finish off the talk with a few photographs of the Aurora Borealis. And this was bittersweet for my guests at the time, because we were actually in just about to tuck into our dessert in a nearby restaurant, and all of a sudden I had a warning come up on my phone that there was an imminent solar storm. So we had to quickly put down our dessert spoons, pay our bill, jump into the minibus, and as soon as we got out, this happened, and we were confronted with the most amazing Northern Lights display, which then went on for the next 3 hours. There was just so much happening. It was happening to the north, to the east, to the south, and to the west, where you had to remind yourself to stop taking photos and actually just to stand and watch and admire what was in front of you. Very briefly, as far as settings are concerned with Northern Lights photography, a good starting point I find is sort of 1600 ISO, the widest aperture possible, and shutter speed of maybe 15 seconds. Ideally, you want a fast, wide lens. This gives you the shortest shutter speed so that you don't get star trails, and a short shutter speed will render the Northern Lights more as you see them, as opposed to a 30 or 40 second shutter speed with a slower lens, where you just get kind of blurs of green and purple. So I use a dedicated 14mm 2.8 for this kind of photography. And the final image of my afternoon and of your morning. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak at your group, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing the seasons in the Nordics. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Very interesting and beautiful pictures, giving us a lot of different ideas on what we should be how we should be shooting.
Very different perspective. I truly enjoyed the shots and some of the starkness of the black and white. So thank you very much for your unique perspective.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We got one. We got a lot of great comments about your presentation. I'm trying.
Nice. Yeah,
is there a difference of your workshops versus your tours?
There is actually, yes, and I make this plain. I make this quite clear. I think it's important that people know what they're booking onto. So workshops for me are UK based. We also incorporate where it's the group size can number anything between 3 and 6. 6 is always my maximum. Sometimes, however, a lot of my workshops in the UK, perhaps some of the more mountainous areas, for example, might only have 3 people. And where you get lots of one-on-one tuition, and there's Lightroom and Photoshop, image critiques and tutorials. So there's lots of hands-on tuition, whereas tours are overseas, more location-based, where I'm taking care of logistics, of course, the day-to-day running, making sure you get to great places at the best times of the day, but I'm always on hand. I'm not just going to sort of say, right, here we are, off you go, and away you go, as it were. I'm always on hand, and actually, the kind of the natural way that I work anyway is that I will intermittently go up to everybody and ask how they're getting on and ask to see their photographs. But there are just some people that tell me from the off that they're just happy being on their own taking photos. But yes, it's important that when somebody books that they're aware that workshops, sort of, for me at least, are UK based, and overseas tours. There is some tuition involved, but not so much. Shall we say not so much, because there's so much logistically to take care of.
Sure. Yeah.
On occasion, I mix the two. I call them my creative visions workshops, where they're overseas, but they still include tutorials and critiques. So I do mix it up, and so you get that option as well.
Great. Anybody else have any other questions? Getting a lot of great comments, inspirational talk.
If you want, if you're interested in seeing some of my local work as well, of which the flowers and insects and the landscape of where I live as well, then if you head on over to my website, you'll see projects. For example, I'm a great believer in practice. Another one of my lectures called Passion Projects, where I spend anything between a few days to a few years undertaking a project to photograph a particular species or a location or using a specific technique. So yeah, if you do go over to my website, robertcanis.com, you'll see some of the work that I've made, both locally and maybe a bit more overseas. If you'd like to see that, which I photographed in the Czech Republic and in Italy, for example, then there's some examples there.
Sure. I did put your website in the chat for everybody, so make it a little easier for you to get there. He does have a great website, a lot of beautiful pictures on there. That's what got me.
I'm having a new one built, which should hopefully become live within the next month. So there's a new updated version of what you're seeing with bigger photos and much more user friendly, I think. So hopefully it'll display the photos much better than what you'll see them now.
Sure.
All right.
Sure. Yeah, Marty and I are working on a bunch of websites, so
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Yeah. So I know that can be a lot of interesting work trying to get a new website up and going.
Yeah, it can. It can take longer than you think it's going to take as well.
Yes. Yes, it does.
Incorporating online bookings and things like that as well. It's there's a lot of work involved. I'm appreciating that.
No. So, yeah. Any other questions before we let Robert go and he can relax for the end of his day?
Sure. And the beginning of yours.
Yeah. Well, Robert, thank you very much for coming. Like I said, great images. I think everybody really enjoyed it. We had a good number of people turn out for us for a holiday weekend.
Right, it's good to know.
We were up in the high 50s, so that was really great.
That's really nice. Thank you all very much indeed for taking the time out to listen to me. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And well, one of these days we'll have to have you come back probably and show us some more stuff.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.
We'll do that. I'll keep in touch. So thank you.
Thank you.
And if we'll open it up for just general questions for about 10 minutes here.
I'll say goodbye then. Thank you.
We'll see you, Robert. Thank you.
See you again. Bye, everybody. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So does anybody have any questions, comments? Yeah, Hubert.
I was curious, does anybody use a Wacom tablet? Probably mispronouncing it.
Yeah, Wacom tablet.
Yeah, Wacom.
Yeah.
I've used one. I don't use it too much anymore.
What's the learning curve with it?
Well,
Do you
it's
use
a
one,
good
Jeffrey?
one. Yeah, I use one. I don't use it as much as I should. The way that I tell people to try to learn to use one is to put your mouse away for 30 days and just use the tablet. Because it's just like using a pen, and you can do everything with that tablet that you would with a mouse, but you've got a lot higher control with a pen because you're used to writing with a pen. So it can be, I use it for when I need to do detailed work. Because it works tighter than a mouse, and with the pressure sensitivities and that, you can adjust how much it's doing. So it can be pretty nice. I work with a small one. It's only a 4x6 inch. I don't have the bigger ones anymore because I was using them when I traveled. A lot of people use there's a bigger one available, which does make it a little bit easier. Yeah, it looks like Drumma's got the big one.
Yeah, I have been berated by a lot of the professional photographers that I've traveled with about I should use it. I personally, I don't really like it. I have twice over the years been through what Jeffrey just said, where I put my mouse away for 30 days and tried to get used to it. And I kind of did get used to it. And I must say, and maybe it's only because I've been using a mouse for what, 30 years or something. Um, I can do everything with my mouse. There is a couple of little situations with the pressure using the pressure pen that might help with Photoshop. But generally, I just go back to the mouse. It's quicker and easier.
Yeah, it's the only time I go to it is really, well, the main one is I do a group shot for our camera club, and I have to mask out the background. So I'm going around heads and bodies and around everything, and the mouse just isn't sensitive enough for that, where I can use the pencil and I can get in pretty tight with it, and it works a lot quicker than the mouse would. Other than that, I gotta admit, mine sits 90% of the time now.
Yeah, and I've
But
been kind of wondering if I should sell mine and get rid of
yeah,
it. The thing I didn't like about it the most, I think, is that there's a one-to-one mapping between the tablet and the screen. With a mouse, you can pick it up and move it to the other side of the screen and that sort of thing and continue to move. And this one, it's a large piece next to my keyboard, and you're limited because of the one-to-one relationship to a spot on your screen.
yeah,
That's my biggest problem with it.
yeah. See, I don't work with a mouse, I work with a trackball. So, because I don't have the room to move a mouse around enough. So I like the trackball where my hand can sit on the trackball and just move my mouse wherever I need to. But I've used the trackball for years. So
Hubert,
that does give me a lot more control.
are you a Mac or a PC guy, Hubert?
Mac.
So to get kind of the sense of it, I don't know if you use the trackpad that Apple has instead of a mouse.
No, I haven't tried that.
So that might be one way to kind of get a feel for what the Wacom would do for you by using that instead of a mouse.
Okay. I just see a lot of when I've been on watching some workshops and stuff like that, or tutorials. A lot of these guys are using these tablets in their selection and stuff like that. And I know I get frustrated with that mouse sometimes trying to get the exact what I want to get. So, but they just said they use them because they think it's more accurate and easier to use. So I was just curious what real photographers use, not the professionals. So
Yeah, and that's why when I'm masking out something that's real intricate, the trackpad, the Wacom tablet just gives me that extra control that I need. It does take quite a bit of hand-eye coordination to get your hand used to where it is on the trackpad compared to where it is on the screen. That's why I tell people, just put your mouse away and for 30 days, just use the Wacom tablet, and then you get that pretty good. Yeah, Tony.
Do you, excuse me, when you are doing something very fussy, delicate, do you enlarge the photo on your screen to be able to get into the tight spots when you?
Yeah, I'll zoom into 100% usually, so that I can get into the tight spots, and then I'm able to use the bracket keys to shrink down the size of the brush that I'm working with, and you can get in and do pretty detailed work. And I'm more steady using a pen than I am a mouse or a trackball when it comes to the real fine stuff. And I can draw better lines with it. So there are times when it's still handy, but I got to admit, for 90% of my photography, it does sit on the side here and I don't turn it on.
Thank you.
Oh. And that's why I have the 4x6 inch one. It doesn't take up that much space on my counter, but
Yeah, mine
Yeah.
takes up quite a bit of space in between that.
yeah,
and
that
the door there.
that bigger
It's
one takes up a lot of space. I like the 4x6 because I can travel with it if I need to.
Yeah.
And
I
Um,
was missing, I have on my mouse, I zoom in and out with the wheel. And I enlarged the brush and changed the feathering of it with my right mouse key. And to
oh,
set the
okay.
buttons up on the Wacom pen, it didn't work exactly the same way. And so I ended up having to use the buttons on the side of the Wacom tablet. And that was a little, I got used to it, but I just didn't feel that it was as fast as keeping my hand on the mouse and operating the keys and the wheel with my right hand.
Yeah, and see, for us Mac people, we don't have as much of that control.
my brother uses the tablet almost 95% of the time, but he's not a photographer. He's an artistic designer, works in multiple layers, has lots of details, lots of text. I mean, some of his work is 16 layers deep. But he's been using it for so long. So unless you're truly involved in the whole entire process, there might be other options that you could try before, such as some of the, enlarging and so on, before you invest in the tablet, because it's almost like you have to be dedicated to it.
Yeah, there's a definite learning curve with using it.
And they're not
And
cheap.
a lot of people get frustrated.
And I think mine a few years ago, I think it cost about $350. And I just didn't think that it was worth it.
Yeah. See, and the 4x6 one that I bought was $100 from Wacom. And it always did what I needed it to do. So I didn't want to spend the $200 or $300 to go to the bigger tablets. The easier tablet to use is the one that's an actual monitor where you can look at what you're doing. That would really be nice, but those things are, I think they got one now that's like $400 or $500, which isn't too bad, but that's an expensive way to go. Anybody else have anything? Everybody's stunned after Robert's talk.
Apparently, Jeff, they know everything.
Yeah, or they know everything. Yep, that could be true. Well, it was great to have our first European speaker. So,
Oh yeah, very nice.
definitely getting worldwide here, and
Yeah,
a
I get
lot of
envious of
fun.
those guys traveling like they do to some of those far places. I follow a gentleman called Andy Mumford, and he does the same kind of workshop type things, traveling over there to the Faroe Islands and all those different places. It's just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But the travel involved is quite intensive. So,
Well, from what I understand, it's sort of like us traveling between states. For them, they travel between countries.
yeah.
It's a little easier when you can travel just a couple hours instead of what it takes us just to get over there. But
I drove down Route 66 several years ago to put together a portfolio for PSA, infrared, black and white. And we kept running across people from England and Germany and France, and hardly anybody from the United States along the Route 66. And we went to a mini museum, some service station. We asked the woman, why are there so many people from England? And she said, I think it's because in England, you can go to the far ends of the country like in one day. And here we have these vast open spaces, and people see these great Western movies and everything, and they can't get over even just the Great Plains that are spellbound. And then they come to the mountains, and then, you know, on Route 66, then you get to the, you know, the Pacific Ocean starting all the way back in Chicago. Then they have these tours where they can rent a car or a minivan in Chicago and go all the way, you know, to the Pacific Ocean. And I think they cherish and love Route 66 and the plains and the mountains and the foothills, and you know, more than Americans do. We take it for granted. That's probably the same thing that's going on in Europe.
I had the same encounter when I was on Route 66. I ran into a whole flock of Germans riding Harley Davidson motorcycles across the country. So, but did you do yours in a Corvette?
No, that would have been nice. We just used just our Ford Explorer.
Okay, all right.
I always wanted to do Route 66. I've done small pieces of it, but I've never gotten to drive it straight. Hopefully some year, but
they have Route 66 festivals in different countries, even in Japan and Germany and all. You know, much larger scale Route 66 festivals than we have in the United States. Ours are pretty, you know, local, smaller
isn't that
towns.
funny?
Yeah.
Huh. And it's such an interesting road for people.
Well, it's going to celebrate its 100th year in 19, and you know, it was founded in 1928. It was actually an amalgam of different routes that they put together, like one big highway. But then it became defunct pretty much after the interstate system.
Yeah.
There's still, believe it or not, I think it's 80% of the old Route 66 roads are still there. So there's, you know, a lot to see. Some of it's bicycle and, you know, footpaths, but there's a lot you can drive down.
Well, I know Hazelmere
Congress
just
appropriated
did a
money.
Tour.
Yeah, I think there's bills in Congress to celebrate, like a national celebration.
Wow.
For Route 66.
Oh. No, that would be neat. Someday. Well, anything else? Otherwise, well, it's noon. We'll call it a day. Everybody can go have some leftover turkey sandwiches. I know I've got enough turkey to last me probably for the next week and a half. But so thanks everybody for coming. Like I said, December we will have a video that I'll put out, and we'll be back in person in January with Jamie and Len's babies. So we should have an interesting 2024 coming up for you.
Merry Christmas.
Yep.
Thanks, Jeff.
God, it's already thinking about that. So everybody have a great holiday and good New Year. We'll see you in January.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay.
Thanks for all the work you've
All
done
right.
to put this together.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks. We'll see you. See everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, we're
Well, Marty. Oh, I gotta do this.